Here it is. Good evening, dear friends. It's my joy to welcome you all. Thank you very much for supporting our continuing educational sessions. And it's my absolutely distinct pleasure to present to you Dr. Linda Safran from Toronto, specialist on the Byzantine, but not only arts. And today we're going to hear about Orthodoxy underground and cave churches in the south of Italy. Most amazing subject. I have to say that many years ago I picked up an antiquated book from 1950s by John de Crenne of Belgium, who put his travelogue from 1956 in the form of a little book. I don't know how I came across it, but I read that book and I get fascinated with the subject ever since. It led me even to travel twice to Calabria to explore the churches and to see the beauty that they hold. And when I came around the articles by Dr. Safran, it was even to great edification, and I chose to share with you my excitement, and she mercifully and kindly agreed to share her knowledge with us. Thus, Dr. Safran, welcome. I'm passing microphone to you. Thank you and welcome, and we are looking forward to your wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me share the screen. You're seeing my full screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Okay, so Reverend Ilya asked me to talk to you about something about Southern Italy, and I made a selection that I hope you'll find appealing. It's certainly a pleasure to see so many people coming out to hear about this topic. So, Orthodoxy underground. Why build underground at all? Underground structures, houses, animal pens, places of worship are found wherever there is soft stone that makes it less expensive to carve than to build. So we find these in China, Turkey, and the region that interests me the most is Southern Italy, which has been a focus of my scholarly work over the past 30 years or so. And in particular, I've worked on the heel of the Italian boot in a region called the Salento. So this region was part of the Byzantine Empire from the 9th to the 11th centuries, after which it was conquered by the Normans. And we don't need to go into a lot of history in detail, but it's worth keeping in mind that even after the Byzantines were kicked out of Italy, the later political rulers and people continued to support the Orthodox churches and monasteries because they were eager to have anybody saying prayers on their behalf. Greek books continued to be copied in the Salento long after the Byzantines were gone, and Orthodoxy continued in the region in certain villages and towns until the 18th century. Now, not everyone on this broadcast is familiar with Orthodoxy, I suspect. Just very, very briefly, the differences between Greek Orthodoxy or any of the Eastern Orthodoxies and the Roman Church, with which some of you are more familiar, are both doctrinal and practical. And one of the biggest differences is that the Orthodox do not think that the Pope in Rome is the head of the church and that he is infallible. A more important difference is the status of the Holy Spirit and whether the Holy Spirit proceeds exclusively from the Father or also through the Son. So there's a difference in how the Eucharist is practiced. The Romans use unleavened bread. The Byzantines and their descendants use leavened bread. Priests in the Orthodox rite can marry. There are many differences, but those are some salient ones to keep in mind. And I'll be referring to the Orthodox Church and to the Roman Rite Church. The term Catholic isn't really relevant until a little bit after the period I'm talking about, but you can substitute Catholic for whenever I say Roman or Roman Rite. So the Orthodox rite and practice continued even after the Byzantines were kicked out, and it's attested until the 18th century. Greek language also continued in the Salento for many centuries. And in fact, in some villages in that area, the old people and now some young people speak a dialect of Greek. It's called Greco, and it's different from modern Greek and Byzantine Greek, but it's recognizably Greek. So my title, Orthodoxy Underground, does not at all mean that the faith was forced into hiding. It simply means that in some places and on some occasions, worship was conducted under the ground for very practical reasons, mostly because it's cheaper to carve stone, as I said. I suppose there are also positive implications for a hot climate. Right? It's cooler, the temperature is moderated throughout the year underground, but predominantly the reason for building churches, carving churches underground is because it's simply less expensive when the local limestone is so soft. So there are two ways to excavate and access rock-cut churches. One is to dig a space horizontally into the face of a rocky outcrop, and you can see a couple of examples of horizontal access on the left side of my slide. The other is basically to dig a hole in the ground and stairs to conduct you down into the bedrock. So rock-cut churches is the proper name for all of these, both of these types in English, but sometimes they're called cave churches. I might slip and call them cave churches, but very rarely are they natural caves. They're almost all excavated for a specific purpose in the local limestone. And as I've said, they're cheaper to construct, and so that made them a good option for a family or an individual who wanted to construct a small, either a place to live or, for our purposes today, a small foundation that would continue to pray on his or her behalf and the behalf of his family. But there were certainly built churches, above ground churches in the Salento, built by the bishops, built by larger monasteries, or simply by patrons who had plenty of money. And I want to show you the two basic types of above ground churches, because the rock cut or cave churches usually imitate one of these two types. The first type is called a centrally planned church or a domed church. And that's the most popular type of church building in the Byzantine world from the 9th century onward. I'm showing one subset of that type called a cross-in square plan. And on the bottom left, you can see how the 4 vertical supports marked there as black circles, those are columns, create the impression of a cross shape, marked in red, inscribed in a generally square plan. I'm talking about this plan here. I hope everyone can see that. And when you have those 4 supports, they could be circles on the plan, meaning they're columns, or they could be squares, meaning they're supports called piers. Creating that layout gives you a total of 9 subcompartments in the building. So you've got the area under the dome, number 1, and then I've marked them here. 2, 3, 4, and 5 correspond to the cross arms. And then you've got the little corners, 6, 7, 8, and 9. That creates lower, generally darker compartments. So we're looking at, on the top, actually the church I wrote my dissertation and first book about, and here I am decades ago, looking very youthful. And you can see that the highest part is the dome, and then you've got the cross arms that are higher, and then the lower corner parts. And here's just a view inside to show you that the dome in the center normally would have painting, the painting here has fallen away from the dome, but we've got the area that supports the dome, these triangular segments, and then we've got remains of painting, in this case, 6 layers of painting, but that's not important for this purpose. In the dome, normally, a Byzantine church would have the most important decoration, which was the image of the Pantocrator, Christ as the ruler of all. And below him would be angels or prophets, or in this case, the evangelists writing their gospels. And then in those 4 tall cross arms are the principal feast scenes, things like the baptism and the nativity, the cycle of the Christian liturgical year. And at the lower walls and lower vertical supports are standing saints or images of saints. And they're down there so that the faithful can interact with them, can touch them, can kiss them, and other kinds of interactions. The other type of above ground church in the Salento and elsewhere is the basilica. And a basilica derives from Roman architecture. It's a longitudinal rectangular building with a projecting focus at the end, an apse. You can see the cross and square at the top also has an apse, a central apse, and 2 smaller apses. This one does too. The subsidiary spaces are important for preparation and enactment of the liturgy, but the visual focus is the central apse in a basilica. The visual focus in a centrally planned building is the dome. So in this basilica type, it's not as common in the Byzantine world after the 9th century, but it's remained very common in the Byzantine provinces like southern Italy and in the Roman world. So the projecting east apse has the most important painted decoration, as does the rest of the east wall. And again, the standing saints would be on the lower walls and the vertical supports. Okay, that's an overview of Byzantine architecture in 30 seconds. Rock-cut churches carved out of the stone don't have any need for vertical supports, but they still generally imitate one of those 2 church plans. So this is a plan of a wonderful cave church at Giordignano, and you can see that it's basically a cross and square, right? But it's underground. They chose to resemble, the patron chose to have his space resemble a built church. What we're looking at here is actually a plan of what the ceiling of this space looks like. When you can see the elaborate treatment of what are fake domes. I'll show you an interior view in a minute. Fake domes and fake wooden paneling, fake wooden beams, that's a better word, of all the other compartments. So there's a real effort here, structurally unnecessary effort, to resemble a built church. A built church clearly had more status. Why won't, okay. This is looking to the east apse of the plan we just saw, and you can just see a hint of the pseudo dome on the top. But what I really want to point out here is the liturgical furnishings that, again, imitate those of an above ground Byzantine church. We've got a freestanding altar in each of the apses, and a freestanding altar not attached to the wall is typical in an Orthodox place of worship. Roman Rite churches tend to have their altars attached to the back wall. And notably, we've got a screen carved out between the place where the people were in the church and the place reserved for the clergy. So if we go back to the plan, we're looking at a line like this, blocking off the 3 eastern bays with their pseudo domes that have the altars inside them, a place where only the clergy would go. And we're standing in the space under where the dome would be if it were a built church and it had a centralized dome. Okay, so this Templon screen, as I said, separates the sanctuary area for the clergy from the people. And you probably know that the screen became taller and more opaque as the centuries went on. And I found this image of Reverend Elia's screen online. I hope I've got the right one here. It becomes what we call the iconostasis, this multi-story screen that completely blocks the whole eastern end, the whole sanctuary area. But in the Byzantine centuries and in the Middle Ages, the screen was not that high and was not completely opaque. So the worshipers could see better what was going on in the area of the altar. Now, cave churches must always have been very dark. Sometimes there are niches to hold an oil lamp. People could have carried candles and additional lamps, but all of the nice images I'm showing you are a product of artificial illumination. You can see that very clearly in this slide. Here as well, without the 20th century and 21st century lighting, these would be extremely dark. This is a different cave church in the Salento. You can see the temple on screen. I've labeled it, the altar. But what I want to point out here is the ledges at the base of all of the vertical supports, which could be used for seating. So one's comfort was considered, I think, by the people carving out these churches. Some of the caves were completely frescoed. Fresco is the fancy art history word for wall painting in which the pigment has been applied to wet plaster, the wet surface of the wall, so that the color adheres extremely well. So here's a small rock cut church. We're looking toward the west end of it. The whole east behind where I stood to take this picture is gone. There's no original wall or paintings left, but you can see that some of these were completely painted. And this one is fascinating because it's got a flat ceiling, but they've painted the Pantocrator in a circle at the center of it, as if he were in the dome looking down. Because we're facing west, we see him upside down. If we were turned around, we wouldn't see such a nice view of the painted wall, but the Pantocrator would be right side up. This cave church actually has a dedicatory inscription here over the door. It gives the date 1196, but it's very, very unusual because it is covered on the ceiling and on part of one wall with scenes from the liturgical year, with feast scenes. So the entry into Egypt, the baptism, etc., and the nativity here on the left wall. That's really exceptional, and I'm not going to focus on this rock cut church today because it is so unusual. As we'll see, most of these rock cut churches are limited to one narrative scene, if any. And that should raise a flag. Why is that different from built churches, which are covered with such scenes? Well, it's because most of the time, maybe all of the time, the rock cut churches were not used for regular liturgical services throughout the year. You've probably already noticed that many of these churches are in poor condition, and there are several reasons for this. Moisture is the biggest problem. It permits plants, plant life and insect life to flourish on the walls. And even the rock cut churches that have been restored usually have an infiltration of moisture very quickly that simply makes the paintings fade away. All of this white bloom is from moisture, and of course, so is the black on the lower walls. A lot of these places have been in continuous use, but not as churches since the Middle Ages. They were repurposed as animal pens or for tobacco drying or for quarries. And here's a case where a rock cut church served as a later quarry. You can see the step effect of cutting down the levels from the floor to get blocks of limestone. And in this case, one whole wall, this front wall, has completely fallen away as well. So that's two problems so far, moisture and quarrying. Another threat to these interiors is graffiti. A lot of it is modern, egotistical tagging. I don't need to show you what that looks like, but I wanted to make the point that there is also pious graffiti from the Middle Ages. Now, the best example of that was not in a rock cut church. I'm taking the liberty of showing an example from a built church. This image of St. Barbara from a church at Casaranello was painted around the year 1000. And it must have been considered a very effective icon. Icon is the Greek word for image, an effective image because it attracted a lot of pious graffiti. So I've got an enlargement there on the left. We're looking at this area to the left, our left of the saint, painted on that yellow background. It says, "Remember, Lord, your servant John and his wife and his probably children." So that's something that was painted there very soon after the image of St. Barbara was added to this church. But scratched just below that, you can see where my cursor is, it says, "Remember, Lord, the servant of God, Michael, who's a cleric." And then above the painted text are some Byzantine dates. And on the other side of St. Barbara, there are more dates and more texts, as you can see, all of the white scratched graffiti. So all of that graffiti is nothing to be upset about. In fact, it's extremely valuable information for how people responded to images of painted saints. I suspect that this image was credited with producing a miracle, and all the later viewers wanted to be a part of that, wanted to be close to the saint and to insert themselves into the fabric of the fresco of the wall. Another kind of damage that we see frequently in the cave churches and the built churches can also be dated to the Middle Ages, and that is when the wall is pitted to get another layer of plaster, to get another updated layer of fresco. You simply take a sharp tool and make these repetitive cuts. And of course, we would love to know what was so important that it had to be had to replace these images underneath. But clearly, the subsequent patrons wanted to update their images in some ways. Here you can see the mother and child, and I hope you can make out the layer of fresco that covers the pitted layer. Okay, finally, the last threat to these rock cut churches is, well, it's still human intervention. Until quite recently, they were unlocked. Reverend Elia was talking to me at the beginning about how hard it is to get into these sites now. But when I started my work in the 80s in these sites, you could walk into most of them, and that was good for me, but it was bad for the wall paintings. And this is the worst example of that. Vandalism, where in this case, the figure of the Christ child was hacked away, no doubt for sale. The Italian police actually managed to find these pieces that were taken, and so they were restored, as you see on the right, It's not perfect. The child didn't emerge unscathed, we could say, but better, of course, that it was found than that it was not found. And the result is that now most of these sites are in fact locked and better protected. So after that brief introduction, I want to spend the rest of my time talking about three of my favorite rock cut churches, sort of increasing the level of detail with each of these case studies. The first one is a rock cut church at Carpiniano. And what's intriguing about it, among the things that are intriguing about it, is that it dates entirely to the Byzantine period. And it contains the oldest dated paintings in the entire region. So what happened is a small space was dug out here, and then as more people used it and time passed, they continuously enlarged it and continually painted it. So starting with this corner, which is the right side of the bottom slide, we'll look at it more closely in a moment, on the east wall, they kept painting along this wall, turned the corner, and painted all along this wall. So we have this sort of capsule snapshot of Byzantine painting in the Salento from 959, precisely dated, to about 1075. The Byzantines got kicked out about 1071. So that first painting is this. And in a minute, we'll look at the inscription that is here next to the enthroned Pantocrator. And we see in this flat roofed rock cut space, there was no dome. So the Pantocrator was moved to the apse, to the niche as the focal point of the space. And he is flanked here by Mary and Gabriel in the scene of the Annunciation. Very often, as I said before, there's just one scene in a rock cut church, and it's usually this one. And of course, it's a very important scene. The incarnation made ultimate human salvation possible. So it's certainly not an arbitrary choice to have the Annunciation flank the Pantocrator. He's seated there in a fancy throne, holding a gospel book on his lap. And painted next to him with the date is this inscription: "Remember, Lord, your servant Leo the priest and his wife Chrysolea and all his family. Amen." And then the signature of the painter and the precise date. Now, painters' signatures are very unusual in Byzantine art. And in Carpiniano, in this humble rock cut church, we have quite a few of them. So that's really a fantastic addition. We also have here the name of Leo's wife, Chrysolea. And you have to ask yourself, who was her patron saint? And it was probably Saint Cristina, who's considered a megalo-martyr, a great martyr saint, but is hardly ever depicted in Byzantine art. Why do I think Cristina was important here? Because Saint Cristina is painted 6 times in the Carpiniano rock cut church. So it may be that the association with Saint Cristina started right here in 959, and subsequent patrons who added their own images and their own family inscriptions to the walls maintain that devotion to this otherwise not very, how shall I say, popular saint, at least artistically not very popular saint. Excuse me. Now, one of the very last paintings, and I've marked the location of it in red here on the plan, so dates to the mid-11th century. They've painted the whole east wall and the whole north wall. One of the most important is certainly this one. A niche was carved out for a burial, and you can see space that marked the tomb, perhaps wasn't the actual tomb, but marked it here. And this is the most elaborate ensemble of texts and images in the Carpiniano rock-cut church. And it's also one of the most expressive inscriptions in all Byzantine churches. Expressive, as you'll see in a minute, for the amount of emotion that the surviving father devotes to his dead son in this corner. Here's a close-up of that niche. So we've got Saint Christine standing along the back wall with a long inscription on a two-color background on both sides of her. But over the tomb, sheltering the tomb literally and figuratively, is the Virgin and Child on the left and Saint Nicholas dressed as a bishop, his usual depiction in Byzantium, on the right. Let me just go back to the whole thing so you see that sheltering effect that we see more clearly when we're closer in and looking up. Here's the text. It's a little bit long, but I want to read at least some parts of it. You read down our left side and then the right side. I find this extremely moving across a millennium. Here is buried the gentle Strategules, my very dear child. He was loved by his father and his mother and his brothers and his cousins and his friends and schoolmates and even his slaves. Like a sparrow, he flew from our hands and filled his family with sadness. And then the saints who are depicted are invoked. O Mary, divine mistress, since you're the source of all graces, with Nicholas, the wise shepherd, with the victorious martyr Christine, place my dear child in the bosom of Abraham. Then we switch to the other side here, and it becomes a bit of ego gets injected. I have recovered with new images. I have excavated a tomb for the burial of my body. The father expects to be buried alongside his son, which of course is the norm, a family tomb. But regarding the name itself, you say, who could this mortal have been? A little bit mysterious. And unfortunately for the father, his name remains unknown because the fresco is simply worn away at this point. So for all the trouble that he took to be recorded for posterity, his name is lost. We only have a few letters of his name. He describes himself as virtuous in his habits. He had a low-level title of Spafarios, and he says he lived in Carpiniano and is a servant of Christ and the saints who are depicted here. Now, this inscription is composed in meter. The fancy Byzantine texts are in a 12-syllable meter. So that could only be done professionally. Whoever this man was, he was not a poet. Even the person he hired to compose this poetic inscription was not an excellent poet, but the fact that he paid for a metrical inscription, paid to have this carved out and decorated so extensively is really telling. And I find this still to be a very moving lament for a dead child. To the best of my knowledge, it's the longest painted inscription for a deceased child from the entire Byzantine world. Now, even though this is the only tomb preserved inside the church, it seems very likely that the Santa Cristina at Carpiniana was a funerary church, a funerary chapel, which means it was used for commemorative services by the family or the village that supported it for a 100-year period, from the oldest painting in 959 to about 1075. And it was still used after that point. A chapel was built on top of it, and this 18th century white marble altar was inserted into it. You can see the tomb of Strategulus here to the left. However, there are no more paintings or inscriptions that suggest use by an Orthodox clientele. Intriguingly, though, the 18th century altar preserved a Byzantine Theotokos and child, as you can see from the enlargement. Okay, we're going to move forward now, forward in time, to a rock-cut church at Vaste. It was cut horizontally into the rock. The cinder blocks on top are just for stability. You can ignore them. And when you go inside these three doors, here on my plan, we're standing in the, we're looking at this red line, we can see that it's a miniature basilica. Right? It's a longitudinal building with apses at the east end. And this church was dedicated to Sancti Stephani, which is St. Stephen's plural. And in fact, there are three images of Stephen. So one was not enough. We can imagine that different patrons had their own expressions of devotion to this saint and to others. He's not the only saint represented in the church. Now, importantly, in the early 20th century, there were still traces of a Templon screen at Vaste, and I've marked its location on the plan. So that's good evidence for its use originally as an Orthodox church, but as we'll see in the next few minutes, that's a kind of a complicated topic. The earliest frescoes here were done around the year 1000, so roughly contemporary with Carpiniano. It got different layers of painting after that, and the last big campaign of painting was done in 1379 or 80. So in other words, 3 centuries after the Byzantines had been pushed out. Now at Carpiniano, there were only names of patrons, but at Vaste, we have pictures of them. We have representations of the people who probably paid for that painting, or at least are commemorated by their survivors in the form of small kneeling figures, as you can see. I'm showing you the small family group in the central apse. In the focus point of the church, my red circle shows you where this family is, and on top of them is a Greek inscription that evokes lady. We'll see soon that there's a lady in the apse, but it really means Mary. Remember, lady, your servant Antony and his wife Zulitia and their 2 daughters, of the village of Nuci, which is about 6 kilometers away from Vaste, and it gives the Byzantine year. And by the way, Byzantine years, some of you will know that the Byzantine year starts on September 1st, which is my birthday. That's just a coincidence. And that means that our years today often have this date with a slash in it, right? Because the Byzantine year started in September, not in January. We communicate what that year was with a slash date, in this case, 1379, 1380. Now, notice that all members of the family, the father, who is largest, the mother, and the 2 daughters, are in identical poses, which is to say they're kneeling and their hands are pressed together. This is not the Orthodox pose of prayer. The Byzantines stood for prayer and had their hands extended. This is the Roman Rite pose of prayer that was adopted starting in the 13th century, kneeling and with hands together. So we have a complication right here, right away. Who are these people? Their inscription is in Greek. Are they following Orthodox practices? One other item, detail that makes us ask this question is that about half of the, ignore this word, that doesn't belong there, half of the figures have what's called a paternoster slung over their arms. This is the chain of beads, the string of beads that lay people in the Roman church used to keep track of their prayers. However, those look like features of people worshiping according to the Roman rite, kneeling, clasping hands, holding a paternoster. But we've got this little figure kneeling next to a saint who is identified by inscription. He has a tonsure, meaning his hair was trimmed, in this case to imitate the crown of thorns. This is something that was done in both the Eastern and Western churches when one entered monastic life or the clerical life. He is wearing a white garment which Orthodox priests wore for the season between Easter and Ascension. So he is an Orthodox priest monk called a hieromonk. So we have this complication here at Vaste that I'm already signaling about what kind of orthodoxy is being practiced. It's got an admixture of features one would expect in a Roman Rite church. One thing that is astonishingly unexpected at Vaste is the decoration of the eastern apse, the central apse. Because in the center, very clearly, is the woman described in the book of Revelation. I've got the quote there in white. A woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. That's exactly the text that appears on the scroll held by St. John, the author of the book of Revelation. So there's no doubt about the identity of this scene. It's a scene from the book of Revelation, the woman with the crown of 12 stars on her head. Revelation was not a canonical book for the Byzantines. It's only quite late, around the 14th century, that the Apocalypse comes to be considered a standard book in the Orthodox Church. By the 14th century, this woman described in the book of Revelation with the 12 stars and clothed with the sun is understood to be Mary. And the family that's praying next to her does address her as lady. Now, around the niche part, the convex part, concave part of the apse is another scene that is unprecedented. It's actually helpfully labeled here in white, in Greek, the lamp that Zechariah saw. And we have the prophet Zechariah at the upper left holding a scroll with his prophecy in the biblical book of Zechariah. And here's the prophecy in case it's not fresh in your mind, and why would it be? He talks about a lamp all of gold, and its bowl upon it, and 7 lamps upon it, and 7 oil funnels to the lamps, and 2 olive trees above it. Now look closely. I've labeled the 2 olive trees, which are red and not green, probably some transformation of the pigment interacting with moisture over time. But if you look very closely, you will see that the lampstand Zechariah is talking about is the gold menorah. Can you see the arms here? Here's the trunk of it, if you will, and then it's got the arms branching out with lamps on the top. So the menorah is in the Bible. It was in the Jewish tabernacle. Later, it was in the temple in Jerusalem. It's described in the book of Exodus. It has this, it's a lamp of gold that holds up oil lamps on its many branches. Now, this scene of Zechariah's prophecy is unprecedented. There are no examples of this as the focus point of any church, East or West. And I had to ask myself, what could be the possible motivation for choosing this very unusual imagery at Vaste? Now, it's true that Revelation 11, just before the prophecy that talks about the woman, and that's on John's scroll here, refers to olive trees and lampstands. So that's the simple explanation, that the patron knew his book of Revelation well. I'm saying his, it could be his or her, that he knew the book of Revelation and wanted to refer to that in the apse curve and the apse wall. But Revelation 11 talks about 2 lampstands, 2 menorahs. So what's that about? Did the artist just run out of space? Did he forget it? Okay, that's possible. But I think there's a more interesting textual underpinning that helps explain this, because it turns out that there are some Byzantine homilies that describe Mary as a golden lampstand, Mary as a menorah. She's said to be a vehicle of light, but not the source of light, which is Christ. And she's golden because she remained a virgin untarnished, just like gold doesn't tarnish. Now, these homilies were written in the 5th century by a man named Proclus of Constantinople. But the only surviving manuscript of those sermons was a 10th century copy in southern Italy that was and remained in southern Italy. No other theologian so explicitly connected Mary to the menorah. So you may know the Akathistos hymn, for instance. Mary is a torch-bearing light who kindles immaterial fire, but she's not explicitly a lampstand, and there's no reference to Zechariah. So I'm not willing to give up on my idea that these homilies, of which existed in the region, were possibly known to the planner of this. Okay. We've got Zechariah, he's in the Old Testament. We've got the book of Revelation. Still, it's exceedingly rare to have this imagery in medieval art. And I searched for a catalyst, a reason to have this, to have made this choice. And I think I found it. I think it was inspired by the actual presence of a huge gold menorah in the cathedral that is closest to Vaste at Otranto, which is about 14 kilometers away. Now, I'm sure you know that all Christian churches are considered heirs to the Jewish tabernacle and the Jewish temple. They wanted to plug into, churches want to plug into that sanctity because God gave the instructions for building the tabernacle and the temple. And among God's instructions were to erect golden menorahs. So installing a lampstand like this was not unusual in a European church. We have preserved examples. And in fact, I've stuck here in a view of the cathedral at Otranto, I've stuck in an actual surviving gold menorah from a church in Germany of about 1,000, just to evoke it for you. We know about the menorah in the cathedral at Otranto from this 14th century monk who traveled from Verona in northern Italy down through southern Italy and on to the Holy Land in the 1340s. The menorah disappeared a long time ago. Believe me, there's no huge golden menorah in this site anymore. But that traveler described it in detail. In the Cathedral of Otranto, before the high altar, is this candelabrum of gold. He tells us how high it is. He tells us it has 7 branches with 7 lamps on top, the form of which is as God instructed Moses to make in the tabernacle of the covenant of God. And this is fascinating, what he says at the end. All the Jews in those parts went often to admire it, because it was very beautiful, costly, and large. And in fact, there were very important and sizable Jewish communities in the Salento. That's a topic for another day. But here in the description of the menorah, James of Verona, Jacobus of Verona, thinks to mention that the Jews are coming to the door of this cathedral to look at this evocation of what to them is the lost menorah. So with its yellow painted menorah, this modest rock-cut church at Vaste, I think, is evoking the golden menorah in the nearby cathedral, and beyond that, the temple in Jerusalem. Even a cave church can be a temple. Now, in the rest of my talk, I want to look at another cave church, another rock-cut church in the Salento. It's smaller than Vaste, but in some ways, it's even more mysterious. I first visited it in 1996. I went again in 2007. Since then, the stairs that lead down into this hole in the ground have collapsed. So these are pretty valuable pictures. The site is called Limonaci, which means the monks, and it was dedicated, as we'll see, to Saint Michael. It's now on the grounds of a rather nice winery. If you go down the hole, if you could still do it today, you see the stairs on the left and the plan on the right. It opens up into a rectangular space. So it's not a cross and square. It's kind of a sideways basilica, really the simplest plan that I've shown you today. As usual, there are two unnecessary vertical supports to hold up the ceiling. That's not necessary. And they've got a ledge around them, and there's a ledge around the whole interior that could be used for seating. At some later point, somebody opened a hole in the ceiling, and that's marked in green on my plans. That hole would have let out candle smoke and let in more light, but it certainly was not original. So we're talking about a very dark, underground, small space. We're going to be looking just at the some of the paintings on the east wall, which you can see has two square niches or apses. So when you come down the main stairs, you see the Archangel Michael right opposite you, right? Kind of confirming the dedication that is also attested in an inscription to the Archangel Michael. And as I said, we're just going to look at this section of the east wall that's marked in red. All of the letters on the plan indicate separate paintings. Okay, starting at the left edge, in the first shallow niche. Let's start at the bottom. I hope you can make out here the fringes of this colorful cloth. I hope your monitor or screen is big enough to do that. We've got a fringed cloth here. So it's like an altar cloth, or the cloth that is under an icon, is under a panel painting of a sacred figure to show it honor and reverence. That cloth is called a podeia, and I gave you the term here. So we've got a quite colorful red, blue, fringed cloth under this icon, this painted image of a saint. And the saint is labeled. He's labeled in Greek, St. John the Theologian. You can, I hope, make out the Greek here, O Hagios Ioannis, and then it says the theologian. And he's also labeled in Latin, John the Evangelist. This is the elderly St. John that the Byzantines preferred, not the young John that you most often find in the Roman Church. And for comparison, I'm showing you a small carved stone icon of John that's in the Louvre. That's just a little bit later than these paintings at Limonaci. You see the old man, hair receding, long beard, bending over his book. And in both cases, our painting and this small portable icon, the book has letters on it, and the letters give us the beginning of John's gospel. In the beginning was the word. That's John 1:1. So this is an absolutely typical Byzantine image. Now above John, is something that was very mysterious. That part of what draws me to art history is having puzzles like this and patting myself on the back when I figure them out. And I bet that if I give you enough time, you'll also figure this out. What do we see? We've got blue down here in the corner, and then we've got scales and a fishtail and a few letters. What we've got is the prophet Jonah, because the letters spell out the beginning in Greek of ho prophetis, the prophet. And I've got a couple of late and post-Byzantine images down at the bottom, so you see the sort of thing that must have been here. The fish with his tail at the left, and Jonah coming out, or possibly going into the fish. Now, this was a very popular scene, especially in the early Christian centuries, but it declines in popularity, but it never dies out, as you can see from these late comparisons. And I'm sure most of you know that Jonah was a very important prototype for Christ. According to Christian interpretation, Jonah was in the fish for 3 days, just like Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days, and then both of them emerged. So this is a precedent for Christ that is not at all surprising to find in Christian imagery. So the question I had to answer was, what is the connection between Jonah and John? Why should they be juxtaposed in this very intimate way in the niche on the east wall at Limonaci? And I think the answer is both textual and liturgical. In the Orthodox liturgy, the whole short book of Jonah is read on the evening of Holy Saturday. That is Saturday before Easter. And then chapter 1 of John's Gospel is read on Easter Sunday, the very next morning. So liturgically, the connection between these two makes perfect sense. Textually, it also makes sense, because look how these texts begin. Jonah 1:1 says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah. And John 1:1 is also about the word of God. In the beginning was the word. So important to note that the Roman liturgy has no such connection. Book 1 of John is read on Christmas Day, but Jonah is not part of the Roman Rite cycle of readings at all. So this juxtaposition only makes sense if the Orthodox liturgy were celebrated at this altar. To the right of John and Jonah on the east wall is the Annunciation, which is, as we've seen, the scene most represented in the Italian rock-cut churches. We saw it earlier. Gabriel and Mary are both identified in Latin. And then to the right of them, we've got this large niche that must have been the main apse and the main altar. And in fact, it has a painted cloth, white cloth with red and blue edges and some decoration on it. So that's our altar. It's a Roman style altar attached to the wall. And above it is a dedicatory inscription. And here it is. This most venerable church of the Archistrategos Michael was built and decorated with paintings with the cooperation and effort of the soldier Surrey and his wife and either child or children during the reign of Robert, third son of Charles, in 1314/15. It was painted by the hand of Nicholas and his son Demetrius of Salento, which is a nearby town. You who read it, pray to the Lord for them. So there's confirmation of the inscribed date within the text itself, because Robert was King Robert the Wise of Naples, and I've given you his years of rule here. So we have plenty of confirmation in this text itself that This painting and the rest of the paintings at Lee Monarchy date to 1314/15. Now, below the inscription, here's the inscription we just looked at, is the scene of the crucifixion. And we'll look more closely at that in just a moment, but I want to point out the sorrowful Virgin to the left of the cross. We've got the young St. John to the right. Angels are on two sides of the niche. You can see this beautiful angel, I hope. And one intriguing detail that I wanted to share is that under the cross, we've got the skull of Adam. This is absolutely typical in Byzantine and also in Western medieval art. The Adam was thought to be buried at Golgotha, which means place of the skull in Aramaic, and this was the site of the crucifixion. So we had the old Adam's grave there, and then Christ, the new Adam, martyred on top of it. So can you see the skull with the huge eye holes? I'm hoping somebody will nod and tell me that you can make that out.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
okay, great.
She's very clear, ma'am.
Okay, but let's look at the crucifixion scene itself. There's a detail here that suggests European, Roman Rite iconography or imagery here rather than Byzantine. And that's the fact that there is one nail, follow the direction of my red arrow, and you see the dark color here, one nail that pierces through both feet of Christ. That is done in Western European medieval art, as opposed to Byzantine crucifixion images. Something else that's kind of surprising when we've just talked about the Orthodox liturgy in the niche to the left is that over the cross it says in Latin, Victor Mortis, which means victory over death. Now, that's not a surprising sentiment. Obviously, that's what Jesus is credited with having achieved, victory over death, but it's unprecedented in a crucifixion image because the title of the cross, this plaque that was on top of the cross, is described in all four Gospels. And it said, according to the Gospels, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Moreover, that cross title, that plaque, was a relic that was on display in Rome in the Middle Ages. And it said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It did not say Victor Mortis. So you sometimes see Victor Mortis on a flag that Jesus holds. For instance, this is Giotto's image in Padua. But as far as I know, there is no comparison to this use of Victor Mortis as the title of the cross. That said, it's clearly a message about salvation, right? Victory over death. And that suggests a funerary function for the church. That also goes well with the Jonahs emerging from the fish. It also emphasizes, I think, Easter, right? The victory of Christ emerging, conquering death accords with Easter. It accords with when the Gospel of John and the book of Jonah were read. And I think this emphasis on Easter and on salvation is supported by one final detail. I'm showing you just a bit of the ceiling from the rock-cut church at Lee Monarchy. You can see it's got red flowers and blue stars. Here's a blue star. The remains of a red cross, which was destroyed when that hole was chopped in the ceiling. But there's also a bit of figural imagery. Here it is, sort of in front of Jonah, John, and the angel of the Annunciation. We've got a couple embracing, canoodling, if you want, among the stars and flowers. Now, if you're facing the east wall, you see them upside down. You see them right side up, only if you've got your back to the wall, the way a priest would see them if he looked up from his work. Now, the man's hat and his shoes and the woman's gown, tightly belted, go very well with the early 14th century date. So these figures are not a later addition. I can't say whether there were more figures elsewhere on the roof at some point. They're the only ones that are preserved now. But what are these secular looking people doing on the ceiling of a cave church? One Italian scholar proposed that we're looking here at a portrait of Surrey, the donor of the church who was named in the inscription, with his wife, but I completely disagree with that. There's no reason to connect this episode, if you want, to that text. Medieval patrons are only shown in a devotional pose. They're standing or kneeling or next to some sacred figure. They're never shown on a ceiling. So I think we can toss that explanation that this is a portrait of the patron right out. If it's not that, then what is it? It may have suggested to some people a well-known verse from the Song of Songs, from Canticles. The verse is there. His left hand is under my head, his right hand embraces me. This is from the Old Testament, but by the 12th century, Christian commentators understood that the bride of the Song of Songs was Mary, and that the bridegroom was Jesus. This was not part of Orthodox liturgy, but there were lots of homilies on the Song of Songs, including manuscripts of famous homilies on this, on the Song of Songs from the Salento region itself. So there could be a textual basis for this couple on the ceiling, but as you can see in comparing them to a manuscript that I've got on the slide, they don't have halos. They don't have classical clothing. They have no signs of sanctity whatsoever. So whereas originally I assumed that the Song of Songs was behind this image, I later decided that was not the case. And in fact, this secular couple in their secular clothing with no halos has some better analogies outside of scripture. One is that they look like couples who represent the vice of lust. This is an example in sculpture from 13th century France. So if they represent lust, then they're kind of a parody, what's called an antitype of the Song of Songs couple. And there may have been some literate viewers who got that connection, who understood that this could be a parodic antitype. But I don't really think that's the case. And part of the reason I don't is that, remember that they're surrounded by flowers and stars. Those are well-known metaphors for gardens and for paradise in general. So according to long-standing tradition, the Annunciation and the Crucifixion both took place on March 25th. That's this week, I just realized. And that date marked the beginning of spring. Joan and John are also read for specifically for Orthodox Easter, which this year is not till May 2nd. So I'm building up here to an analysis about the season, about spring as a season of new life and resurrection. And here's, I think, a very close comparison. This is also, this embracing heterosexual couple is also how the astrological sign of Gemini was represented in medieval art. In antiquity, they had two males representing Gemini, and you may think of the sign that way, but in the Middle Ages, it was usually a couple. And they're shown embracing like this, and this one is labeled Sun in Gemini, Sol in Geminos, which refers to the season of Gemini, which is May and June. Now, it's true that May, June is later than Easter, but it's still a metaphor for springtime, for love, for rebirth. And I find this comparison very compelling. So if the painted couple on the ceiling connoted springtime, then the implication for rebirth fits perfectly with the liturgy for Easter, when Jonah and John are both read, and also with the Annunciation and crucifixion scenes. And it also suggests a larger context, that the zodiac and the seasons are part of God's plan, just like the life and death of Christ and the human potential for victory over death, victor mortis. Remember that the beginning of human history started in paradise, in Eden. And John's book refers to in the beginning, which echoes Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. And of course, Christ's sacrifice was understood to make possible a return to paradise, to make possible the union with God. That is the goal of Christians. And let's not forget that it's the Archangel Michael who's supposed to conduct the souls to the last judgment, which will lead to those who deserve it to paradise. So to sum up, this is an aspirational, hopeful pictorial program. I think that the patron Sure might have established a small monastery where prayers would be offered for his soul and those of his family members. The fact that there are two altars suggests that both rites, Orthodox and Roman rite, could have been accommodated in the same place. And we have plenty of evidence that that was true in some medieval churches. So he and his family were almost certainly buried not inside, but on top of and around the church. So I'm wrapping up now. We've seen that the paintings at Vaste and Limonaci contain some unexpected details. We've got evidence for the persistence of orthodoxy. Jonah and John juxtaposed only makes sense in an Orthodox liturgical context. We've got a hieromonk and a Templon barrier at Vaste, but we've still got Roman type crucifixion iconography here. And we've got paternosters and people kneeling with hands pressed together at Vaste. So these paintings show us that Orthodox practice was adapting and changing as time passed and as the Byzantine centuries receded and the Roman Rite began to dominate in the region. Now, adapting and changing are signs of life, but ultimately the numbers of Orthodox clergy and faithful declined. The churches were abandoned or reused, as I said, for other purposes. And it's really a miracle that we have so many beautiful traces of them today. The most unusual medieval Christian imagery occurs in the rock-cut churches. Now, above ground churches preserve nothing as surprising as the apse at Vaste or the couple on the ceiling at Limonaci. In built churches, the standard repertoire of feast scenes and saints predominates. But the rock-cut churches weren't used for daily liturgy, so they didn't have the same expectations for their decoration. They were much more intimate spaces, probably used by families or small groups, mostly for burial rituals. And for that reason, I think there was more opportunity for personalized imagery and surprising juxtapositions. Now, more than any time since they were carved out of the rock and painted and brought to life by the sounds and smells of the liturgy, these rock-cut churches are beginning to be seen as having cultural value. But many of them are private property, and there just isn't enough funding in Italy to preserve them all or to restore more than a select few. And I take the liberty of suggesting a recent book on the topic. If you'd like to learn more about them and about other visual evidence for life and death in the Salento in the Middle Ages, I humbly recommend this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for most beautiful presentation. I think that I
Thank you.
would say on behalf of everybody who here, because I received a number of compliments, and probably you could see them, about how wonderful your presentation is, and there were several questions, and I do have a few questions, if I may ask.
Okay.
Maybe I'll probably post something about your book, and probably could stop sharing so we could see your face, if you'd like.
You'd like me to stop sharing?
Stop sharing, yes, so that we
Okay.
could ask you some questions. Thank you
Yep.
so much. It's really truly amazing.
It was my pleasure.
I don't know how many of our listeners and participants of today have traveled there, but it brought a lot of memories, and you certainly addressed a number of the questions that I had during my visit there. But I wanted to ask, first, probably to be polite, I'll ask a question that our listeners have sent in, and that is a couple of questions on the subject. As you stated that those columns were absolutely unnecessary. Those were more of architectural features rather than practical features. Is there any way to tell why you think so? Maybe there were indeed supports, so the ceiling won't collapse.
Well, I've been in several rock cut churches where the columns or piers are, what are they, stalactites? Which are the ones that hang down, where the base has been removed, either deliberately or accidentally, and there's no ill effect. So I have personal structural experience of not feeling unsafe in underground spaces where that was the case. There are some rock cut churches where there are no vertical supports, where it's an undifferentiated open space. If the rock is strong, there's simply no structural need for them, but they help connote church. They suggest that help suggest that this is a space of worship. And presumably they differentiate the space in some modest ways, although it's hard to see how that could be in Limonaci, which is just so small and shallow. But in the other ones, as we saw, they can separate the space for the worshipers from the space destined for the clergy. I'm prepared to be corrected if there's a structural engineer here who thinks that they serve a purpose, but to the best of my knowledge, that's not the case.
Thank you. One question was very interesting. Also, paid attention to it, but I didn't go as far as to ask a question. I'm very happy that our listener asked that question. In Church of St. Cristina, I believe there was an inscription on a halo of Christ which says light instead of the existing one, so phos instead of on, typical. Is it due to the fact that it was a funerary chapel, or do we have some other parallels where in halo it says phos, or the light?
Phos is absolutely what I expect in a Byzantine church. That's the normal inscription on, if there is one, on his halo. You're saying that you wouldn't find that nowadays?
Well, in many Byzantine churches, you could see on, or the existing one, the omega or n. Certainly through medieval period. So probably there are some other examples. I'm just trying to think right now, but most typical one, starting in probably 13th century, would be the inscription on. That's what I encounter more often. But again, I'll be happy to be corrected.
I brought back that picture, phos. I've never remarked on it because I've seen it in many 10th century churches.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you. A question that I had, in many rock cut churches, and probably we can acknowledge that there are several hundred of them that still bear some traces of fresco. So there are really a lot of them in that region of Salento. In many churches, there are frescoes, images of Saint Basil and Saint Benedict next to each other.
Just one.
Just one?
I know which one you're thinking of.
All right, because, okay, then I'm standing corrected. Does it have something to do with coexistence or interaction between Benedictine and Basilian communities, Orthodox and Catholic monks, or not?
Okay, Basilian is not the word we would use for the Byzantine and even post-Byzantine era churches, because there was no order of Saint Basil.
Right.
So it can't be used in the same way that we say Benedictine. But Basilian is the traditional name in southern Italy, and it's a term I've tried to correct. So I'm going to take the opportunity to make that correction here. It's not surprising in southern Italy to find a saint such as Benedict or Francis in a church that also has some traditionally Orthodox images. That's the wonderful and exciting thing about southern Italy, is that it was conquered by everyone. It had waves of people passing through, and there was coexistence for most of its history. In the same way that the monk Jacobus of Verona could remark on the Jews being at the door of the cathedral at Otranto, in northern Italy, that was not the case. That would be a shocking thing. But we have ample evidence for cultural overlaps and interconnections in the South for until quite late in the Middle Ages. So I can't think of the name of the church that you're citing, but I can picture it very well. That's the only sole case that I know of for Benedict and Basil standing next to each other. But as I've said, I've seen Francis's too. In the few remaining liturgical books from southern Italy, most of these were bought up at the beginnings of the early modern period and taken to repositories elsewhere, but there are some still in southern Italy. We find that there are prayers that don't appear in any other parts of the Orthodox world. For instance, for Saint Mary of the Snows, which is a feast in Rome, the Santa Maria Maggiore. For Francis, there are Acoluthiae for Francis, for instance. So it's something that's found in this region. Pictorially, it's not so common to see that juxtaposition, but it does occur. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that makes it a very interesting place.
Now, thinking about it, I'd have to look it up, but I'm thinking that Foss would be more typical of Romanesque frescoes depicting Christ than the Byzantine. That's what I'm thinking. But I'd need to look it up, because I'm thinking of a couple of manuscripts where in Halo it says Foss.
I think you won't find it so unusual.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much. One more question. An impossible question, and I know how stupid it would sound, but I'll try to explain myself. Who was there first? Westerners and Easterners, and why I'm saying that crypt of the original sin. Some of the earliest frescoes that are clearly of Western provenance, and it's probably was a Benedictine community there. Could we say that it was inspiration for local Greek community to have monasteries alike, or they have nothing to do together and was just common trait, as it was all throughout Asia Minor and all throughout Italy?
First of all, there are no stupid questions. Secondly, this area, southern Italy, was part of what's called Magna Graecia. It was these were ancient Greek communities, hundreds of years before we can talk about the Byzantines. In the earlier Middle Ages, so let's say before Carpiniano, which has the oldest dated Byzantine paintings, it was almost a town by town difference, whether it was ruled by the Lombards, the Longobards, or the Byzantines. And each town varied. A place like Otranto, which had the Golden Menorah in the 14th century, that was Byzantine, and that was Greek and remained in Byzantine hands for almost all of its early medieval history. Nearby towns passed into what we would call Roman Rite or Lombard hands, and we had in this part of southern Italy the so-called Greco-Gothic wars, the Ostrogoths against the Byzantines. So it's very complicated, and it's the question has to be asked on a case-by-case basis. So in the area of the Salento are some of the oldest Benedictine traces of some of the oldest Benedictine monastic foundations anywhere in Italy. Excuse me, I'm talking about 6th century monasteries that lived and died in the area. So we had a mixing of cultures the whole time. And by mixing of cultures, I don't just mean two Christian persuasions, but also very important Jewish communities there from the beginning, from the 1st century BCE. So we have tombstones from all of these different groups. My book is an argument about how these groups, the nearby presence of these groups affected the others. And we find some traits that are carried through across all of the faith groups. For instance, the way that they, excuse me, the way that they choose to devise inscriptions by emphasizing the placement of the name of the person who paid for it by putting that at the end of the line, for instance. We see that in Hebrew, we see it in Greek, we see it in Latin. That said, each different group had slightly different information. The Byzantines tend to give the tax cycle, the indiction information. The Jewish inscriptions often give the specifics about the date of death. The Greek tombstones don't do that. So the groups had their own internal developments, but they were also affected by their neighbors, I think in profound ways. And very often, as in the case of Limonici and Vaste, we have these very interesting painted interiors. It's quite hard to tell who used them. You know, it's a blurry line and not a clear line. When does someone stop being Orthodox? Is it because they use a paternoster or press their hands together and kneel? They probably didn't think so. But someone coming from Constantinople might have thought that these were heretics.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. In many brochures.
Hold on one second. I've got to see if I can increase the volume on these headphones.
Okay.
Let's try again, please.
Thank you. In many
yes, worked.
Thank you. In many brochures, granted that they're of course non-academic character, and on many websites, you could read such statements as number of Orthodox came to southern Italy due to the iconoclasm of the Byzantine emperors, and then during the Muslim invasion and this and that. Of course, naturally they were there from the beginning because those were Greek communities. But and another thing is, of course, that most of the monuments and most frescoes are survived from much later period.
Well, that's one reason I wanted to share Carpiniano, because that really is all Byzantine.
All Byzantine.
But this is the kind of general statement that tour guides make. You know, that quote unquote Basilian monks fleeing iconoclasm came to southern Italy, and there's really very, very little evidence, if any, for that. In Sicily, we have some textual evidence for one such occurrence. In southern Italy, we have no textual evidence that happened. There is one church, maybe you know it, in Mottola, where there is some decoration on the wall that is exclusively of red crosses on white plaster. Some scholars have interpreted that as evidence for it dating to the period of iconoclasm. I don't find that compelling. I think the cross was always a popular kind of decoration, and it was an inexpensive kind of decoration that you didn't need a professional painter to put up. So that is like many things that tour guides will tell you. I think that's not borne out by the facts.
Well, I really thought it was an absurdity, but I try not to argue, because if you're looking at it, it was much more Greek than Latin till the medieval period. I mean, yes, there was different communities, but still the provenance, it was, Hellenistic,
Hellenistic, but not necessarily continuous. The ancient Greek is not the same as the Greek we find in the Salento, which, as I've said, is not exactly the same as the Greek one finds elsewhere in the Byzantine world. But there's no question but that the church in the Salento in the Byzantine era was very, very close to Constantinople. There's plenty of correspondence between them. They get information about updates, liturgical updates pretty quickly. We can tell from manuscript copies, and Greek books continue to be copied in the Salento for centuries after the Byzantines are gone, with a special flourishing between about 1280 and 1320. And remember, the Byzantines are out of there in 1070. So there's an attempt to maintain and keep alive Greek culture, Greek language, Orthodoxy, in a time of enormous pressure, when there were no longer any Orthodox bishops within a few generations of the Norman conquest. But that said, the Normans built Orthodox monasteries. The prayers of an Orthodox monk are just as effective as the prayers of another kind of monk. Apparently, they thought so.
Right. Maybe you would know, or at least you probably could guess, as to why, for instance, in Calabria, which seemed to be poorer region than Apulia overall, there were many more churches as monuments, as structures, preserved monasteries and build-up churches. Granted, there is hardly any fresco decor left in them, in time when in Apulia we see by far more cave churches. Why is there such a difference? Or it's very subjective observation?
Yes, it is a subjective observation. I guess it comes down to a question of preservation, doesn't it? I mean, the problem for Apulia, among the problems for Apulia, and among the waves of conquest, were the fact that the Ottoman Turks took over part of it in 1480. So there are cannonballs still in the streets in Otranto. And so there was a lot of destruction of vestiges of orthodoxy that Calabria didn't face, for instance, right? Apulia is simply in the line of fire there. There are a lot, I would say there are a lot of churches and monasteries and evidence for those in Puglia, and not just in Calabria, but I admit that I know Calabria less well. And one of the reasons for that is that it has to do with another kind of invader, and these were the Arabs in the 8th and 9th centuries, which had more of an impact in Calabria than they did in Apulia, although they left traces in Apulia as well. So I don't think that a case could be made that in the Middle Ages there was a disproportionate number of Orthodox churches or monasteries in one of the Italian regions over the other. But I confess I've never counted to see what the numbers might be.
It just at first glance, surviving medieval Byzantine monasteries, monuments, they are more numerous in Calabria, and there are by far fewer cave churches, at least with the traces of monastic.
Well, that suggests that that suggests that the type of stone is different. Apulia Calabria, if you don't know, is very mountainous, and
Right.
Apulia is quite flat. So you get that environmental potential reason for digging into the ground. Apulia has several important ravines, and so you get the horizontal excavation of the churches alongside. I mean, they permit, perhaps they permitted the construction or excavation, I should better say, of cave houses and churches more than Calabria did. But as far as surviving churches, I don't think that's the case. I mean, there are some excellent examples in Calabria of Byzantine churches, and I've been to, I think, most of them, but there are quite a lot in Apulia as well. My book only deals with sort of evidence for human life. That is to say, if a church didn't have surviving paintings or graffiti, I didn't study it because I was trying to get at what medieval life was like. But there are dozens and dozens of monuments that were relevant just to me, and that means there are many more out there. And Apulia is a much bigger region than the Salento. So the farther north you go, yes, the more Latinate culture there was. Sorry, I don't have the numbers to back up or challenge.
Thank you. Thank you. No. It's just a question, nothing else. Well, thank you so much. Dear friends, if you have any questions for Dr. Safran, please now is the time to ask. You can do that by raising of your hand or by sending a chat, or I can turn the microphone for you if you'd like.
I'll also put back my first slide, which has my email address on it. If you have a question later on, feel free to contact me.
Thank you. I know that I'll have some, and I'll definitely going to use your invitation. But if there are no questions, I really would like to thank you, Dr. Safran, for her time and for her outstanding presentation. Thank you so much. It was very engaging and enlightening, and appreciate your time and your effort, and I'm certainly looking forward to get your book. And there are some of the articles that are available through academia.edu. So if you're part of any academic institutions, you can get access to Dr. Safran's articles, and you could read them. And of course, I'm sure that if you're interested in the subject, or planning perhaps after COVID would subside, a trip to the region, her book would be your excellent guide and beneficial addition. As there are no questions, I would ask the last one perhaps, and that deals with preservation. You did state it very justly that in Italy there are so many monuments, it's simply impossible to afford to preserve them all. But there are examples where from rock-cut churches, frescoes have been removed and placed in the museums, or at least in a bit friendly environment. And it is costly, but it's by far less costly to try to maintain them in their original space. Do you know anything about that being done, or?
Yeah, you're thinking of Santa Maria degli Angeli at Pogiardo, where the frescoes were taken in vertical strips or slabs and moved into a museum space. So one gets, I'd say, a general sense of what it was like to be there. The reason that was done, of course, is because it was under the main plaza of the town. And with the advent of cars, there was no security for those frescoes at all. The real problem in Italy is money. When I started my work in the Salento, friends in the Superintendency of Monuments took me in. 40 years later, those friends are ready to retire, and there's nobody trained to replace them. There's no money to hire people, even to staff the Superintendency of Monuments. So the money tends to go to the famous places like Pompeii. And even there, I'm not saying it's enough funding to do what should and could be done there. Vaste, as you can see from the picture, with the wooden ramp there and the railings, it's gone through more than one campaign of restoration, but the elements militate against preservation. They're underground, and that's not safe. Limonaci, poor thing, there on the bottom right, it's now that the stairs have collapsed, I imagine the frescoes will simply disappear. There's no possibility, unless the winery decides to pay money to preserve them, I don't see any hope for these. So of course it's the responsibility of scholars to make them better known. Even cutting things off the wall takes a lot of effort and will. And as I said at the very end of my talk, it's only in recent years that these are coming to be understood as an important part of cultural patrimony, right? They're not part of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. Not that the Catholic Church has any money either down there. They don't have a natural support group except for young people who recognize their value now, and the occasional old person who goes in with a candle and a prayer. So I'm fairly pessimistic, I have to say, about the survival of these rock cut churches in particular. And the laws in Italy are very clear about personal property and whether the government can take that away, and at the moment it cannot. So an owner is within his or her rights to just let a property disintegrate. I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic, but there's only 2 examples I can think of in all of Apulia where medieval frescoes were removed to a museum setting. There may be 1 or 2 more I'm not thinking of, but it's an expensive process. It requires restoration as well as technical skill, and it hasn't been done in decades.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, thank you so much for all the information. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. I want to appreciate our dear listeners. Thank you very much for coming. Please follow announcements on Facebook page of our upcoming lectures, and surely hope to see you again. Meanwhile, please stay healthy. And again, thank you and all the best.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you very much.